Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Raw Men, episode 15. Today we have Dr. Robert Price, Professor Robert Price, PhD, if you like. He is an author of a great many books challenging the historicity and the authoritative nature of the Bible. I believe you're a professor of biblical criticism. Did I get that right, Mr. Price?
Yeah, that's sort of an honorary thing these days. I did used to teach a bit for the Center for Inquiry, but haven't in years. I do, however, teach online for the Johnny Coleman Theological Seminary in Florida, for what that's worth.
Oh, very good. Would it be fair to call you a historian?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, very good. And I had been referring to you for some time as an expert on biblical history or scriptural history. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I always hate to say, oh, I'm an expert, but at least I have studied and written about the data and the methodology for many, many years.
I'm sorry, I seem to have lost you.
Oh, I'm always hesitant to say stuffy things like I'm an expert, but I have made that the focus of study for many years. So yeah, I guess so.
Okay, well, very good, and a fair comment. The topic this evening is about the history of Jesus. Now, I've argued many times that people want to say that there is evidence of Jesus, even if it is a fact that is somehow not indicative of Jesus. That they want to argue any kind of excuse for what might constitute evidence of a historical figure, and very often they want to argue that the Bible is evidence of itself. That if the Bible says the Bible is right because the Bible says it's right, and strangely, I get non-believers who argue that the Bible should be considered evidence of itself, and so that we can call the Bible evidence. What is your evidence that the Bible is correct? Well, the Bible. And I argue that evidence is not just a string of facts which happen to be concordant with either scenario. It's facts that are only indicative of one available option over any other. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's a little more complicated in that all historians, as R.G. Collingwood pointed out, have to construe what counts as a fact in relation to how the data fits into a theoretical model the historian brings to the evidence to see what sense it makes of the data of ancient records, etc. And very much like scientific theorizing, you look at the data of planetary motion or whatever, and you say, well, now, does that make more sense if the Earth is at the center of the planets or if the sun is? And so you can't really test it out, but you find the most plausible, natural, economical interpretation of the evidence, where you don't have to stretch it and squeeze it and invoke ad hoc hypotheses. And it's the same thing in history, really. There's no way short of a time machine to find out what happened, so you have to see how the data can most plausibly be explained. And you could say that there is evidence for a historical Jesus, but that really is no good. It's mere assertion. You have to look at the gospel texts, the Josephus business, and ask, does this measure up, or does it seem suspicious or unsatisfactory? And Christian apologists, even highly trained ones, understand that that's what they have to do, and they think they've done it, that they've shown the Gospels are reliable and all that. They don't just say, it's in the Bible, hallelujah, so it's true, but secretly, subtly they are, because they say, well, there's no reason to doubt this. I mean, these writers were Christians with high moral standards. What they said must be true. Well, wait a minute, how do we know they weren't hoaxers or delusional or whatever? Isn't it because we still have in the back of our minds this notion, well, the Bible writers tell the truth because it's the Bible? So I don't think they even realize what they're doing, but it is kind of circular, but they're sophisticated enough to know that they have to vindicate the data. I just think they're doing a bad job of it.
I noticed that the way that the way a scientist would approach theory is not the way that I often see theory used in history. With theory, you actually have, where you don't have this in science. In history, you actually have comparative theories. According to the Wellsberg theory, then this should be concordant. So let's, and both theories are possible, and then you have to weigh which one is more plausible, given the evidence. So I mean, and science doesn't have an application like that. I mean, you don't have a choice of two theories anywhere that I'm aware of. Where you have one theory that might be true, or they both might be true, and which one is more substantiated. That doesn't happen in science. But just in the last few days, I've happened across a half a dozen examples where this exact thing does happen in history. When people argue the evidence for the historical Jesus, I want to state that when we're talking about historical evidence of Jesus, then we're talking about something that is outside of the Bible, something that is history. If I'm going to ask for historical evidence of Jesus, I'm going to ask for something that is a history, and the Bible is not a history. A lot of people want to argue that it is, but a book that includes witches, dragons, wizards, magic spells, talking animals, and all of that sort of thing, that is a fairy tale. That is not a history. And since none of the aspects of Jesus' life as detailed in the Bible can be aligned with actual history, then it disqualifies itself. Things like, when Jesus was born both before 4 BC and after 6 CE at the same time, and the events of his death, same kind of thing again, that there doesn't seem to be anything in Jesus' life that even matches up with the other Gospels, much less with history. So I can't consider the Bible to be an historic document. Would you say that the Bible is historic in any sense?
Well, not really. There's the duller, later parts of the Old Testament history might be somewhat accurate, but almost the whole Bible, I think, is basically fiction, the narrative. What more sophisticated New Testament scholars who are not axe grinders, but like Bart Ehrman or the Jesus Seminar fellows, their approach is to say, granted, most of this cannot be sober history, but is it possible that these legends have grown up around a historical figure like St. Francis of Assisi? It certainly seems that he existed, but there's loads of crazy legends about him. Well, they're all of the same sort, and you have to figure, well, there must have been a certain type of a person behind this about whom such appropriate legends clustered. And so they tend to think that, yeah, there was some kind of a Jesus who was a prophet or a sage and got in trouble with the Roman government and was crucified, and some won't go much further than that. And others will say there seem to be data that don't square with the traditional faith view of Jesus, like his occasional statements about getting a sword and how the violent are taking the kingdom of heaven by force. And so some have said that might point to an original historical Jesus who was a kind of a priestly revolutionary. I mean, there were plenty of such people. That's reasonable. So those people are saying there might be enough oddities, loose ends that weren't tied up that indicated there once was a very different story before it became all fable and legend. I respect that, though I don't happen to agree. I don't think you can, in fact, trace anything back to a historical bedrock. Could have been a Jesus, but it seems to me virtually everything in there is either a rewrite of the Old Testament here and there. I mean, it's amazing how many of the stories are directly paralleled, or they come from common mythical motifs. And if that's the case, why believe in a historical Jesus and not a historical Dionysus or Adonis? And so it seems arbitrary to me, but I wouldn't dismiss Ehrman or the Jesus Seminar people as a bunch of fundamentalists or apologists. I have a kind of a gentleman's disagreement with them about whether there's any historical worth to the Gospels. The relevance of extra biblical sources is that if the big, full-blown picture of Jesus in the Gospels is true, wouldn't you expect some notice to be taken of such a character by his contemporaries? And it seems very strange that it's like if Superman existed and you looked at the back files of the New York Times and the Daily Planet, and there's no reference to him. Wait a minute, something strange is going on here. So I tend to think there really isn't any convincing evidence. There's no plausible way of putting the data in the blender and coming out with a historical Jesus.
Okay, very good. Now, a lot of people bring up, and almost invariably this comes up with me whenever I mention that there's no historical evidence of Jesus. If we don't have the argument that the Bible is somehow history of itself, then I get that when I bring up that, okay, we have Jesus who was supposed to have been the king of the Jews, but we don't have any documentation to indicate any kind of degree like then we also have him dealing with heads of state. He's dealing with Pontius Pilate. He's dealing with Herod. Pontius Pilate is dealing directly with Herod on the matter of Jesus, and yet there's no documentation of that either. And all of this is easily dismissed because, these people didn't keep their records that well, despite how well their records were kept. And then people want to bring up, did Socrates exist? Because if we have mention of Socrates in this story or this book, then we don't have anything directly from Socrates, and we don't have anything that we can say concordant with history, so we can't verify Socrates. That argument is, for me, lost, and these people don't understand why I have a problem with that. Socrates is not making impossible claims. We're not talking about zombies wandering the streets of downtown Judea. We're not talking about 9 hours of darkness. We're not talking about how the earth was supposed to have cracked open at the time that he was crucified. All of this nonsense. What we're talking about is I had this teacher. His name was Bob. Well, okay, that's not an extraordinary claim. I have no reason to doubt that claim. Why would two different people be talking about the same teacher named Socrates? There's no reason to doubt his existence. If people want to talk that argument, I've got a much better example. Somebody I really want to exist, Hypatia. From my own personal research, it seems that Hypatia is not as well substantiated as I would like her to be. All references that I'm aware of for Hypatia all stem from one document. That document is not a historical document, and it has some of the features that make it suspicious. Okay, again, with Socrates, we don't have anything that makes it suspicious, but with Hypatia, we do. We have a degree of propaganda, that there is some evocation of emotion that's involved in her story that could have been written for political reasons. It could have been written for to change people's minds or to incite rage. So anything that is sensationalized is going to be suspect. Anything that seems to fit the motif of propaganda for political purposes is going to be suspect. Now, if I'm ready to doubt whether Hypatia existed for this reason, then when you get into Jesus, amplify all of the suspicious traits by orders of magnitude, and that's where I have the problem again. There's everything about the way that Jesus is described in all of his life, to say nothing about the stuff outside of the Bible, all of which makes everything about Jesus highly suspicious. And this is especially the case when we get into what other people would recognize as historical references. When you get outside the Bible and start noticing that nobody wrote about these zombies, nobody wrote the undead saints that wandered the streets, that nobody noticed the hours of darkness, that nobody noticed the earth cracking open or the temple collapsing or any of these other things that were supposed to happen. They can't show any concordance to this at all. When you get into the commentary from the people that lived in his time, the best that they can come up with are people that lived decades later. Mm-hmm. And of course, the first one that everybody brings up, Titus Flavius Josephus. So you're welcome to just take the rest of the show and talk about that guy.
But Aaron, the argument that I've heard the most is just what you said about other people in history. Well, why don't we dispute those people existing? And I always just say that doesn't have anything to do with it. regardless if they existed or not, that doesn't prove or disprove that Jesus existed. I don't understand why the first attempt is always to find another character that may be in doubt. That doesn't seem valid in any way to me.
Well, you made a valid point here, and we should probably address this. That, let's say, because for the longest time I believed that there was a historical Jesus, and some people think that I can't make the distinction between the historical Jesus and the biblical Jesus. And my thought is, if there was a historical Jesus, it's very clear that he was not divine. Because everything that is in the Bible that indicates that Jesus could have been a real person are the very things that indicate that Jesus had no connection to divinity. When I read the Gospels, I get the story about a guy who is essentially a faith healer, no different than any of the shysters or scam artists that we have on stage today. We have somebody who trained his own disciples to go out and pretend to heal people the same way he pretended to heal people, the way that revival tent people will do that kind of healing now. It never really happens. It's just all a matter of faith. You tell people that they're healed, or you tell people to go home, your daughter is healed now because I prayed. And you don't have to verify or vindicate any of that. You just make the assertion because it's all about pretending. You're just pretending that these things happen. So this seems like legitimately real person, a historic person who can't perform miracles in his own hometown. Why? Because everybody knows who he is. They know what he's. We don't believe you. We know what a jerk you are, right? You can't pull the scam on your own hometown, so a prophet is not appreciated in his own lands. And Jesus thought that well, first of all, he argued against the old Jewish tradition about washing your hands. People always want to talk to me about how brilliant the Bible was because people knew that running water will get your hands clean. Well, no, any child knows that running water will get your hands clean. You don't need God's divinity to know that. But Jesus argued that you didn't have to wash your hands because it wasn't what went into your mouth that made you sick. It was what went out of your mouth that made you sick, because he believed in magic words and he believed in demons, not germ theory. So he didn't believe in washing hands, and he cast out demons rather than curing illnesses. He thought that the mustard seed was the smallest of all seeds, even though other farmers in his day at that time knew of at least 2 other seeds that were smaller, the black orchid being one of them. And he curses a tree because he doesn't know when figs are in season. Right? Indicative of a person who is completely flawed and has no real magic powers and is just a scam. This is why I thought there was a historic Jesus, and that's who he was. He was some small-time cult leader who rightfully got stomped on by the mighty empire for raising too much ruckus. But when I became, when I got involved with like Frank Zindler and yourself, Mr. Price, and David Fitzgerald and Richard Carrier and now D.M. Murdoch and so forth, I've had to come to the conclusion that all of these indications that there was this schmuck apparently isn't the case. If there was a real Jesus, it wasn't a divine Jesus. But we're talking about whether there was a historic Jesus. And I've rambled on too long, so I'll let you take it over. Thank you, Bob.
Still, why should we even entertain the question of why other people existed as some kind of defense of if Jesus existed?
Well, there's an odd logic to this. They are arguing, in effect, for, you would think the conclusion would be, well, look, there's no way to know. We just have to remain agnostic about everything. As when they say, look, if you applied to the newspaper the skepticism you apply to the Gospels, you'd never believe anything you read there. And my response is, you mean you do believe what you read there? I mean, just now, Brian Williams, whatever his name is, on NBC is caught out lying. And here's the big news anchor. What? I mean, if you've ever been quoted in a newspaper, it's usually a misquote and an embarrassing one. That's what I've found. I certainly do not automatically believe what I read anywhere. And in the same way, you are right to doubt if Socrates existed. When you examine the evidence, it looks like, well, there's no serious reason to doubt it. He probably did. But when you read of Oedipus and the Buddha and so forth, you begin to realize, well, there's just no reason to believe. Or was there a historical Mithras or Krishna? They're supposed to be the founders, but no. And you have to ask yourself, is the Jesus of the Gospels really any different from that? Is there any apparent historical core? And I mean, there could have been a Jesus, and any real sign of him might have vanished, but there's just no reason to think so, in my opinion. And so when people say, if you were that skeptical, you wouldn't believe anything, well, yeah, put two and two together. Maybe you shouldn't believe in these things, but instead of agnosticism, they say, well, the only alternative is just to believe anything.
Right.
And that's just utterly ludicrous. The same thing goes on in other New Testament areas where some of us say that there seem to be extensive interpolations in the Pauline epistles. Unfortunately, so early that there are, from the period from which no manuscripts survive, one can never be sure, but there is a lot of indications. The text reads strangely, it contradicts, and so forth. That make it look like, yes, somebody probably added this or that. Well, most scholars would say, hey, look, if we take that approach, we'll never be able to confidently say what, let's say, the Apostle Paul thought, because we won't know if it's really him. Yeah, that's probably right. Does that mean that it's not true because it's a big pain in the rear for us? Of course not. Some people do this all the time, magically transforming agnosticism into fideism, and they do here too. And that's kind of funny because the Josephus thing, it bears on that. There's let's assume that Josephus really wrote this passage, this so-called Testimonium Flavianum, which goes something like, about this time there arose a man named Jesus, if indeed it is proper to call him a mere man, for he did many miracles and taught wisdom to Jews and Greeks alike. He fulfilled prophecies. He was the Messiah. He was at the instigation of the elders of our people. Pontius Pilate put him to death, but those who believed in him from the first didn't abandon him, and he appeared to them alive 3 days later, and accordingly the tribe of Christians named for him is not petered out to this day. So that's pretty much it. Well, suppose Josephus really wrote that. He'd have written it around 90-something CE or AD. That means that he's doing nothing but telling us what Christians were saying, because he couldn't have met Jesus. He wasn't reporting from the front lines, and that's what we would have to have. If somebody, conversely, if somebody could come up with an old papyrus letter, and plenty have survived from that period, where someone says, I was in Roman Palestine on a business trip or pilgrimage, and I happened to hear the famous Jesus of Nazareth speak. What a wise man. That's all it would take to consign the Christ myth theory to the dustbin. But that's just what we don't have. And so there really isn't the kind of evidence that would mean anything. I mean, if Josephus actually wrote it, it wouldn't be any more help to the historian than finding out that the Encyclopedia Britannica has an article about Jesus. I mean, they're in no position to know. And so it's just vacuous. But did he write it even? I think not, and there are a lot of reasons for this. It's obviously written by a Christian. There's no way Josephus would have said that Jesus is the Messiah. He owed his life to having turned coat and joined the Romans after being a general in the Jewish opposition forces in the war with Rome. He joined up with a Flavian household and predicted to Vespasian when he was a general of Rome that he would one day become Caesar, and that he would fulfill the prophecy of the star connected with Balaam in the book of Numbers, and so that the Roman emperor would be the Jewish Messiah. There's no way this guy is going to go on to publish a book in which he says Jesus, the founder of the Christians, was the Messiah. It's obviously written by a Christian, and it's obvious Josephus was not a Christian. So, what do conservative scholars say, even people that are not apologists, like John Dominic Crossan and others, they say, well, all right, Josephus couldn't have said he was the Christ. He probably wouldn't have said he did miracles or fulfilled prophecy. So maybe it's just those little items that show this was written by a Christian that were added by Christians. And so they suggest that Josephus did write something even shorter than what we read in all the manuscripts, and Christians added to it. But oh no, Christians couldn't have written the whole thing. Oh no, no. And it's pretty obvious there's axe grinding. As Richard Tierney once said, they're grinding the axe of the apostles. Well, is it possible, is it plausible that here we do have interpolations? Well, that fits what I said about the Pauline epistles, because here suddenly, without manuscript evidence, they're happy to say that stuff was added, even though we can't prove it. But does it make sense? Well, as a recent article by, I believe, a professor named Hopper, I could be wrong, I've forgotten, he says this does not have any signs like an abrupt change of subject, a difference in vocabulary, something that's obviously an explanatory elaboration. It doesn't have any of the signs of being interpolated. I mean, where we know things have been inserted into ancient texts, you can usually tell that there's an interruption. No sign of that. Also, it has a confessional tone to the whole thing. It's not just those bits that sound like Christian texts. The whole thing assumes you know the gospel story. In fact, most of it is put into summary terms. Like, oh yeah, we all know this. And the only two things that are actually asserted by the verb forms and the participles and all that are that his first disciples didn't abandon him, and that Christians have not passed out of existence today, as if this is a Christian polemic against some kind of Roman or Jewish polemic against Christianity. Beyond that, this passage interrupts the context. There are other Pontius Pilate stories in Josephus, more or less adjacent to this one, but in all of them, they're written very differently. They're much longer. Josephus says that Pilate is the protagonist, a villain, and gives you a point-by-point statement of what he did. It's an actual narrative. It's not just referred to as if you already know it. This suddenly is shorter, it's more passive, and Pilate is not really the main actor. It just does not seem to be, it doesn't seem to fit into this style. You could argue that it is somewhat similar to the vocabulary, but then again, that was true of a lot of these writers. It just doesn't seem to be by the author of the surrounding material, and so it seems clear to me the whole thing is simply an interpolation by a Christian. I just need to add pedantically that there are a couple of, oh yeah, let me just say this, Origen, the church father in Alexandria, writing late in the 2nd century, much closer to the publication of Josephus, I'd say 100 years after, but you know, we're nearly 2,000 years afterward. He read this Josephus text and he said, well, one thing's for sure, he didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. So he cannot possibly have been reading what we read in our much later medieval copies of Josephus. So, I mean, that's kind of out of the question. Then,
if I could throw in,
go ahead.
If I could throw in one other thing, I mean, okay, so Josephus is Jewish, and Jesus met none of the Jewish criteria for the Messiah, right?
Right.
Okay, I would have thought that would have settled the argument right there. The Jewish Messiah is somebody that can't die.
Well,
right?
some thought he could and would rise in the millennium or something. But
and he's supposed to be this great military leader. He's supposed to reestablish the temple. He's supposed to conquer all these lands. All of the things that the Jews say that their Messiah is supposed to be able to do, Jesus does exactly none of them.
Mm-hmm. And the Christian answer to that, well, Jesus was redefining messiahship in a more progressive way. Well, what do you mean redefining it? If I say, I'm a Marxist, I'm a communist, but of course I'm a more enlightened communist. I believe in the free market. I don't think you're a commie. Why use that word? And it's just obvious that's an attempt to dodge the obvious facts that you mentioned. Plus, Josephus talks about other messianic pretenders, and he has no use for them. He blames the war with Rome on the instigation of people like Menachem, Simon Bar-Gioris, and these other revolutionary leaders and would-be kings. He's suddenly going to praise one of them and say that he was the true Messiah. It's just ridiculous. It's impossible. And so it's a Christian piece of the puzzle inserted into it.
So then you also have where Josephus is now aligned with and under the provision of Rome. So he's going to praise Jesus as being the Messiah without making any other comment about how he is the Messiah or the Messiah of what, right? It doesn't matter that he didn't meet any of his criteria. There's no explanation there. We don't get any understanding of that. I mean, you have to kind of assume the conclusion. I think you already implied this. You have to already be familiar with the mythos and assume the conclusion before this passage can make any sense. But then to blame whatever happens to Jesus squarely on Pontius or on any Roman officer, to place blame on the very people who are providing for him, this also is hugely suspect, with no apparent benefit from having made that comment.
Well, he does try to shift the blame where he says, at the instigation of the chief men among us, the Sanhedrin, the priests, etc., Pilate handed him over. That does kind of sound like they're trying to get Pilate off the hook, but Josephus doesn't otherwise try to do that. He's quite happy to blame various problems between Rome and the Jews on Pilate. And, of course, Pilate was recalled by Rome for his atrocities against Jews. So this wouldn't have been controversial. He's blaming a guy that's already a whipping boy. So that wouldn't be a problem. But the idea that this writer, whoever wrote this passage, is blaming Jews, not Rome, that kind of fits into this trajectory of exonerating Rome that Christians use to say, hey, look, don't persecute us. That crucifixion of Jesus as a rebel king, no, that was a big misunderstanding. He was railroaded. It's you're just trying to avert suspicion. Maybe Christianity was no longer polemical, but perhaps it was at the beginning, so it sounds a little fishy for that reason too. It sounds like the kind of thing Christians did. Oh, well, it wasn't really Rome's fault, and so forth.
So in my normal dealings with biblical literalists, young earth creationists and such, you're talking about where we understand, the writings of Paul, and how do we know that this was really Paul's thoughts on the matter? But we're talking here about a man's thoughts. And one of the problems that I have with biblical literalists is, of course, that they contrast the Bible versus what they call the ideas of man, and the Bible reeks of the unsubstantiated ideas of man. Am I interpreting this correctly?
Oh yeah. Plus the Bible doesn't even give you the idea that no one had ever heard any of this. In a couple of places in the epistles, at least, I think Philippians, the writer says, do what is right in the sight of all men. This is not Gnosticism where you assume that the human race is in utter moral blindness until Christianity comes. The relationship between Jesus and the Old Testament, as depicted in the Gospels, Jesus isn't introducing anything new there. He quotes the Bible. He interprets it a little differently, but that just means this was an intra-Jewish and Jewish-Christian debate. How do you interpret the texts? Like, okay, we're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, but what really constitutes work? They were debating this all the time among the rabbis and so forth. So there's this notion that if not for Jesus, we wouldn't know our butt from our elbow morally. That's in itself an exaggerated claim the Bible doesn't even make. So there's so much of this. It's like saying there were 3 wise men who were kings. The Gospels don't say this. It's like saying that Jesus collapsed under the weight of the cross and they got a passerby to carry it the rest of the way. No Gospel says this. John says Jesus carried it to Golgotha. The other 3 say no, it was Simon of Cyrene. It's an attempt to just sandwich it together and weave it all into something that no Gospel ever says. So it's a funny thing. You've got, in a sense, the historical Bible, what it actually says, and the Bible of faith that is encrusted with interpretations and rationalizations and so forth. Like, oh, the Bible teaches the Trinity. Yeah, where? And so forth. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and well, okay, you bring up a valid point. I mean, that the Bible doesn't say anything about the Trinity. Neither does the Bible ever say that the serpent in the garden was ever supposed to be anything but a snake. And people always want to say, well, yeah, Genesis says that in Revelations. But you can't say that the last book was written by the same person that wrote the first book. Or that when it says that old serpent, that they mean that old serpent, meaning specifically the one that it was in the Garden of Eden. Because Jesus also refers to the Pharisees as being a generation, the important use of the word there, a generation of vipers, and he describes them as being the sons of Satan. But does that mean that they were in the Garden of Eden too?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. There's sort of a link, but it proves too much in that almost certainly Revelation is referring to the 7-headed dragon, Leviathan, who is a big factor in the book of Revelation, though they don't happen to call him Leviathan. They do several times in the Old Testament. And the serpent of Eden is a kind of a demythologized version of that in all probability, but it's not really supposed to be him anymore. That's probably where they got it, but they're trying to make it less mythical already, even in Genesis. And if you pointed that out, well, if you want to connect them this way, you could. Oh, no, they don't want that because they don't want to admit that the Bible says God created the world out of the carcass of a dragon he killed, which it does say several times. So, no, that's not in the official Bible. What a mess.
Well, you mentioned in all probability, and this goes back to how you believe things and why you believe things. And when we're talking about questionable existence, okay, in the matter of Socrates, I have no reason to doubt that there was a Socrates. I would say there's probably a Socrates. I would believe that there is a Socrates. But when I say the word believe, that means that I think he probably did exist. I'm satisfied that this person did exist. I would probably refuse to change my mind. Likewise, I would like there to be a Hypatia, very much. I think probably there could have been a Hypatia, but I'm not going to say that I believe that there's a Hypatia. I would love to believe that there's a Hypatia, but I'm not going to commit myself, and I would never commit myself to the point that I'm not going to change my mind, where evidence to the contrary couldn't sway me some other way. This is according to all probability. So when we're talking about the historical Jesus, regardless whether we're talking about a theological Jesus, let's ignore for a moment any connection to divinity. Let's say that it is the small-time cult leader, faith healer, shyster, scam artist that I always thought that Jesus was. What's the problem with that character? Because I have people that tell me, this is a very strange thing. About a very dear friend of mine told me just a few days ago that he considers himself Christian not because he thinks that Jesus is divine, because in fact he doesn't. He doesn't think that Jesus is divine. He says that he believes that there was this schmuck who somehow, that there's some kernel of truth to the story. And it doesn't matter that Jesus wasn't connected to the God, that he wasn't the Son of God, that he didn't really have any magic powers. He just wants there to be a kernel of truth to that story. And he got upset with me that why should I have to destroy every last element of that? I don't have any compulsion to destroy every last element of that. Why couldn't I believe that there was, as he put it, this schmuck? Is there a reason, Mr. Price, why we would doubt that there was ever a guy that got a basis of the story who was then exaggerated out of all proportions? Is there any reason to believe there was no Jesus ever at all?
Yeah, the fact that virtually every story in the Gospels looks like it was rewritten from a story of Elijah, Elisha, David, Joshua, Moses, and a couple of others, and you can put them side by side and see this has been taken from here, this has been mixed up a bit here. The fact that you can do that for virtually every story in the Gospels, I can think of one that might not fit. One out of all.
Would that be the loaves and fishes? Because Jesus gets to do that exact same story twice.
And it's almost exactly identical with Elisha multiplying the barley loaves for the sons of the prophets. And so, I mean, that is so close. You got to ask yourself, now, what's more probable? That a guy actually did this, violating the laws of physics, or that somebody just rewrote a well-known, accessible story? And put a different name. I mean, what's more? I mean, this doesn't even mean you are ruling out the possibility of miracles. Oh, maybe they happen. How do I know? But
come on,
more likely?
You're not reading the official Bible if you can ask questions like that.
Okay, now I was in my youth, I was associated with a lot of neo-pagan types because I didn't know much about atheism. I didn't realize that I had an option to just walk away from religion altogether. It seemed like, from the misinformation that had been inundated upon me, that there were certain elements of the supernatural that I wasn't yet able to deny. I mean, or thought that I was compelled to deny. I was led to believe that there were psionic powers and that there astral projection and all of these. All of these things were actually real. This was the way that I was misinformed in my youth, and so I believed that there was, a certain spirituality to the world for a long time. I knew I wasn't Christian, so I walked away from them and found myself in the only groups of people that would be tolerant of non-Christian spiritual believers at that time, and that very often included like pagan groups. And one of these pagan groups, the high priest of Forge Covenant in San Antonio, Texas, he explained to me that his patron deity was Dionysus. Now, of course, Dionysus turned water into wine. Not like Jesus did. Dionysus did much better than Jesus did. Jesus did the Penn and Teller trick, where you pour water in, and when you turn it upside down, it pours water out. You can buy that prop in a magic shop. But what Dionysus did was cause the fountains of the earth to conjure up wine. That's a pretty good trick there. Jesus couldn't possibly touch that one. So, and this, we know that Dionysus, nobody considers Dionysus was supposed to have been killed and then born again, so we've got Dionysus II, right? Mm-hmm. But nobody considers this historical, even though there's a huge parallel. He described himself in so many of the ways that Jesus does. There's so much of Jesus that is obviously based on Dionysus, and Dionysus is clearly much older, at least as far as the story goes. We know that the story is many centuries older than the story about Jesus. So when I'm talking to this guy who says that his patron deity is Dionysus, and he's telling me the story about how Dionysus turned water into wine, I say, you know what, this causes me to think, if there's a real God, and it's God, it's Yahweh, right? Why would God make his son to be not an original idea, but a cheap sequel to a commonly reproduced human idea? So either Dionysus really made water into wine just like Jesus did, or Jesus couldn't really do it either. Those are the only two options as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, this brings up the principle of analogy on which all historical scrutiny rests. You don't know what happened, not having been there. But how are you going to determine what probably happened, whether a claim of an event is probably true or probably not true? Well, you have to, you'll never know for sure. All historical judgments are tentative and provisional, which is why apologists merely pose as historians, because they know what they want to believe and they're defending it. They're like a spin doctor. But the historian knows that you use the principle of analogy to get as close as you can to a judgment of probability. And in this case, you say, well, what did we hear about Jesus? He changed water into wine. Do we see anybody doing that today or in any kind of verifiable recent history? Well, we do see stage magicians do it, but we know how they do it, and it's a trick. Well, I guess he could have done that, but then we have myths about Dionysus and so forth. What does this look like? Well, you have to say that at best, Jesus was a stage magician, like on The King of the Hill. Ladies and gentlemen, the amazing Jesus. Or that it's a myth. Neither one of them works very well. Now, wait a minute. Couldn't Jesus really have been the Son of God who really performed such a miracle? I wasn't there. I don't know that he didn't. But what reason is there to think that it's historically true in his case? All we can say is probably it's not true, because if he really seemed to do it, that looks a lot like charlatans or magicians today. Or if he didn't, he's just a myth. So what's more probable? That's all you can do, or you're going to wind up believing that there are leprechauns and werewolves and that people changed lead into gold. I mean, you're just going to believe anything anybody says? No, you can't do history without some criteria to winnow out the fake stuff. Or as a big comic book fan, I like to say, it's as if I said, The Martian Manhunter, Captain Marvel, these are just obvious fictions, but Superman, now he existed. Why should I believe this? If he's just like these other ones and we know they're fake, why make an exception? And so what do the early Christians say about that? That it sounds so much like pagan sons of God with virgin births and all that stuff. Well, some of them said that God did it this way. I think Justin Martyr says this, in order to make it acceptable to pagans by clothing the truth in categories they knew. Justin Martyr says, you're giving us trouble for the miraculous conception of Jesus? You believe the same thing about Apollo and this one and that one. Don't you see what you're saying there, Justin? It's very dangerous. And the other big one was that because of the Old Testament prophecies of Jesus, and of course these are all yanked out of context, they're not prophecies, because of that, Satan knew what was coming, that the Son of God would be born of a virgin, he'd do miracles, he'd be crucified, he'd rise from the dead, etc., etc. And so he cooked up these counterfeits in advance, so pagans would be thrown off, saying, it's just another one of these, so we know better than to believe in it. These are so desperate. It's like if you knew Christianity were true to begin with, maybe these things would sound good. You'd have to have some explanation for them, but that's just the point. We can't argue in a circle. We don't have any sufficient reason to believe it's true. And so, once again, so much circularity because they're just defending a position they already believe in, and they're not willing to give up, not willing to rethink. Or the few that do wind up getting out of it, becoming New Testament scholars instead of apologists.
So you mentioned Justin Martyr, and yeah, I know that he said, that what you believe about, or what we believe about Jesus is no different than what you believe about the sons of Jupiter and so forth. Importantly, in my perspective, he also said that he did the same thing that Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis believes. He says, we have to believe this part of the Bible, because if we don't believe this, then we can't believe this other half of the Bible. You have to believe the first half in order to believe the second half, if you're going to believe, in the salvation. And so Justin Martyr says you have to believe in the creation Because if you don't, then there's no reason for the salvation in the first place, and the whole theology falls apart. So you've got to make yourself believe. This to me is completely dishonest. I mean, you're talking about the probabilities of whether or not something is likely or probable. Yeah, that's probably true. I think that's likely to have happened. But this is not what these people are doing. They're asserting as absolute fact that this is what happened. And when it comes to Dionysus and Krishna, there's absolute rejection. No, that's a complete myth. And it's exactly what you just said about, Superman versus the Green Lantern being a myth and Superman being, Superman is the one exception. It's insane to me. And then also, if we're going to talk about the historical Jesus, one of the factors that I consider is everything we've just brought up so far, plus the theology, that if Jesus had existed, and of course people want him to be the Son of God, then I have to look at the way the theology collapses, because it's not justified either. The only thing that's going to get you into heaven somehow is that you believe. It's not what you do in life that's there's several different passages throughout the Bible that explain that it's not what you do in life. It's not what you're not being judged on whether you're a good or a bad person. Your good works are like filthy rags in the eyes of God. The only thing that will get you into heaven is whether you believe. Buy the bullshit, or you will suffer a fate worse than death. And then if you believe it and you praise hallelujah with all of the rest of us, then we can promise you impossible rewards we'll never actually have to pay. This is kind of the way I look at it. But I want to make a distinction on whether we're talking about a historical Jesus. Is there any reference to the schmuck that we were talking about? Is there any reason to believe that there was a guy? And more importantly, I've heard like Richard Carrier say that Jesus was originally described as being a celestial character, and who was posthumously kind of given a historic life on Earth that was never in the original documents. Can you speak to that?
I think he's right. There are in the epistles, especially supposedly by Paul, under his name anyway, there are loads of references to the death and resurrection of Jesus or the Son of God or Christ, though Christ is used not as a reference to the Jewish Messiah in Paul, but just as a last name, like Julius Caesar. But these don't place Jesus in any historical context. And it doesn't really even talk about historical circumstances of his crucifixion. Rather, it says in 1 Corinthians and Colossians that he was put to death by the archons, the rulers of this age, the principalities and powers that foisted the Jewish law upon the unsuspecting pious. And this sounds like Gnosticism it's just cut from the same cloth, where they didn't believe that these saving events had happened on earth in the recent past. They believed that at the dawn of time, the celestial Son of God was dismembered by the evil angels and powers, and that his light substance enlivened the world, the material world created by the demiurge, a sub-god several stages down. I think this was historicized for institutional reasons somewhere along the line by people that wanted to pull out the trump card against their sectarian rivals and to say, look, you can believe whatever you want based on crazy mushroom visions or whatever you guys are doing. Irenaeus says this explicitly. But we have it from the horse's mouth. You see, our bishops were taught by people who were taught by people by the very people Jesus taught. So Jesus was a historical founder who established this continuity, this line of succession. We know what he said. You're just making it up as you go along. Well, these guys, their view had been made up too, but they came to say, okay, you see the guy in the picture frame? That's our founder, and we've got the copyright. You couldn't very well do that if you admitted that you got your views from visions and so forth. So, and then others began to play the same game. Gnostics said, well, you know, our guy Valentinus was taught by a disciple of the Apostle Paul, so there. who knows if any of that was true? So it's easy to see why they would have historicized a mythical Jesus. And it seems that explains why virtually everything in the Gospels, not hinted at in the epistles, seems to be derived from the Old Testament. There wasn't any memory of Jesus. Look at the central thing, the crucifixion. In Mark 15, it's all based on Psalm 22. Understood, or I think misunderstood, as an account of a crucifixion. It's not that at all, but certain phrases appear in Mark's crucifixion account put into a historical context. Well, wait a minute. And then when Matthew adds to Mark's, where does he get his additional information? From the prophet Zechariah and the wisdom of Solomon. Hold on. Nobody was there. There was no memory of this. You had to patch together Bible quotes to get. Come on, come on. So it does kind of look to me like the story came about later once they figured, well, let's say Jesus was a figure of recent history. We need him to have been. But the epistles don't even know about that. They don't talk about Jesus as a miracle worker. They practically in 1 Corinthians it denies it as well. You know, Greeks like philosophy and Jews like signs, miracles, but I'm afraid we have to disappoint them because all we preach is Christ crucified. Would he have said that if he knew anything about these stories of miracles? What? Or how about in Romans 12? Well, we know that the Romans only punish the wicked, not the righteous. What? Can you have said that if you thought the Romans put Jesus to death? And it just seems, I think Richard's right, it looks like there was this celestial, angelic character that got demoted to a human for institutional purposes. So I think he's right on the money.
Well, I gotta mention one more thing. And when I was talking about the evidence of a historical Jesus, not the historical evidence of Jesus, but the evidence of a historical Jesus. And I was talking with Michael Hart, and I said that you know I'd read some of Robert Price, and that he points out one thing that I wouldn't have noticed on my own, where Josephus is talking about Jesus of Damnius or Jesus Ananias, and you've got two people whose name is Jesus. One of them is a brother of James, and supposedly there's a high priest, or he's anointed, or he's a Christ, as you might translate it. And then you have a third option for Jesus, which is that Josephus, and I'm hoping that I'm remembering your words correctly, that Josephus sees three people on a cross that he happens to know, and he gets really upset about this because he knows these people, they're friends of his, so he pleads with the Romans to let these people down. And the Romans let all three of these people down. Two of them die, and the third survive. And that, to me, seems like, if you want to cite anything about what Josephus said, that is most likely the Jesus character that a lot of people, glom onto when they're talking about Josephus. Can you comment about that?
Well, this guy, I believe, is not named, but I think that does underlie part of the crucifixion account, because there's an odd question. Wait a minute. If Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for custody of the corpse of Jesus because, criminal or not, heretic or not, he's a fellow Jew, and it was a major act of charity among Jews to bury the dead. The whole book of Tobit is about that, for instance. Well, if he did that with Jesus, what about the other guys? Wouldn't he have done the same with them? And so they're just omitted from the picture. Well, the theory is, if this is based on that passage from Josephus's autobiography, that would kind of explain it. Josephus asked for the three co-conspirators of his from the Jewish war to be let down from the cross, nursed back to health. They did, but two of them didn't survive it. That kind of is the missing piece as to why three were crucified, but one appears alive again. And plus the fact that it's a viable theory that since Josephus's Hebrew name was Joseph Bar, son of Matthias, you wonder if that is the origin of Joseph of Arimathea. That's not some pun. I mean, it's very likely that the Gospels are partly based on Josephus and are written later, and there's other indications of that too. So this may have been borrowed. Well, another one of the Jesuses was Jesus ben Ananias, who was a kind of a scraggly, wild-eyed prophet who went around Jerusalem in the years before the Roman siege, saying, "Woe to the city of Jerusalem! It's going to fall." And people got sick of it, and the Jewish Sanhedrin dragged him before the Roman procurator, who flogged him and said, "Who are you? Where are you from?" Which is just what they say to Jesus in John's Gospel, and he won't say anything except "Jerusalem is doomed" and so forth. So they flog him and let him go. And then a few years later, during the siege, he gets killed by a catapult projectile of the Romans. His name is Jesus, and the Sanhedrin brings him before the procurator, who asks him the same questions and then flogs him, and then admittedly later he dies. And there's more than that. This kind of looks like it was used in the Passion narrative of Jesus. So there is a kind of a link, but it's in the opposite direction that people think. It's not that Josephus attests the historical Jesus. It's rather that Christians have borrowed things from Josephus' stories about other people and put them into this composite fiction about Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, that's excellent. What would you say about Jesus of Damnius? How is he integrated in this?
Some people like to say that, well, you know, it's not only that Josephus may or may not have mentioned our Jesus in the famous Testimonium passage. In his other big work, The Wars of the Jews, there's a statement about a schemer in the priesthood named Ananus, who railroaded the rightful successor to the high priesthood, a guy named Jacob or James, son of Damnius, and that this was the James that is said to have been lynched basically in the temple and stoned to death, his brains beat out with a launderer's club, as Josephus describes it, and that was him. And then when the other Jewish elders who didn't like this treatment complained to the Romans about it, they fired Ananus and brought in Jesus, James's brother, the son of Damnius, to take the position his brother should have held. So it's some kind of justice. Well, he says that this, Josephus calls this James the brother of Jesus called Christ. And as you point out, in the Dead Sea Scrolls and elsewhere, the Christos, the anointed one, sometimes just means the high priest, which is the whole point of the context in Josephus. So this may not at all be a reference to James the Just, as they called him in the early church, the brother of Jesus Christ. It may be two different characters. I mean, there are loads of people named James and Jesus and Joseph and all this, and Judah in Israel at the time. So I think Richard Carrier was the one who pointed this out, and I think he's right. It makes much more sense because look at the context. It's about these intrigues as to the priestly succession, and there is this set of brothers, James and Jesus, the sons of Damnius. So I think that one is not a reference to the New Testament characters at all.
We got to close up the show, but I got to tell you, it's been a fun interview with you on.
Oh, I loved it.
I enjoyed it very much. If I can find any reason to have you back on, I will. Mark, do you have anything else you want to throw in here to close up tonight?
No, it was great to have you on the show. I really appreciate it. We're gonna move on, and all the Ramen podcast supporters will be able to get up on the link and come into this hangout and say hi to Robert if he hangs around, and if not, Aaron and I will be there. We appreciate all the support. Aaron's heading to Australia soon. We're gonna do a lot.
I've got another month.
Well, that's soon to me. That's a lot sooner than I'm going to Australia. And we'll hopefully do a few shows with Aaron there in Australia, so that should be good. We're glad everybody's supporting us and trying to keep the train moving.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and close it up. Mr. Price, do you have anything to say, sir?
Oh, no, it's just been an honor. I appreciate being invited on the show.
Great. I'm glad you were here. All right, everyone. Good night.